Hello, my name is Matt Puckett. This is short video number 4 for Philosophy 1900 at Luther Rice College and Seminary. Today I'm going to be talking about chapters 1 through 5 of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, specifically how he covers that America has changed from a topographical America, one that is primarily, whose means of communication is primarily the written word, to a peekaboo world, which he basically describes as information overload to the point that we have so many images and information coming at us that we can't really focus on any one thing at too long, because as soon as it's there, then it's gone and something else comes back, like playing a game of peekaboo with a baby. For the first 5 chapters, the author relies heavily on the Marshall McLuhan's quote that says the medium is the message. Basically, what he means by this is, and a direct quote from page 9 of Postman, is that the media of communication available to a culture are a dominant influence on the formation of the culture's intellectual and social preoccupations. So basically, depending on what type of medium a culture uses primarily is going to impact how their mind works and how they handle and interpret truth. For instance, a culture whose primary means of communication is oral communication, you're going to have a culture that's going to be relying very heavily on memorization, whereas a culture which is based more on the written word, which is what America and the majority of civilized society was for the last couple of 100 years, you have one where the mind is very well developed in terms of processing data and coming to conclusions and debating and arguing and discernment. And today, where we are a culture whose primary means of communication is visual, you have one that lacks some of the typographical written characteristics. And I think the point that Postman is trying to make, that we as a culture and as believers as well need to be aware of, is the dangers of how visual media can affect our minds. While Postman does not necessarily put down all aspects of primarily visual media, such as television, the internet, etc., he does make a good point talking about how different types of media always have a cost to them. Whereas in many ways, going to a written form of communication has improvements over an oral, you lose a lot of the capacity of sheer memorization that a oral culture had. And also the result, going back to the peekaboo world concept that he spoke of, when we have information overload, when we are primarily a vision-based learning culture, it can be very difficult for us to study in depth or come to conclusions based simply on the written word, and where our attention spans are also negatively affected. He spoke heavily about how politicians and politics have changed greatly. For instance, he spoke about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which typically lasted for hours and would be very well thought out, very information heavy, and people would sit and listen to it. This wasn't spoken about by Postman, but I think about this year in 2020, we've just come out of a presidential election, and I think of what our presidential debates have devolved into, which rather than two candidates giving well-spoken, well-thought-out ideas, they basically devolve into shouting matches where you start throwing personal jabs at the opponent and you start attacking them as people and throwing these little short attacks at them rather than primarily communicating positions. And I think that is definitely a negative downside of us being a visual learning society. So we do need to be aware of that. We do need to be aware that as our culture becomes more visual, that we do need to make sure that we are still developing our capacity to read well and to study intentionally, especially as Christians. You know, God has given his primary means of revelation to us through the written word, the Bible. And as we see the visual start to bleed over into the church and our faith, we do need to be on guard. The scripture speaks many times about studying the word and having a mind that is able to discern truth and properly handle it. And I feel that as we become more visual and as we allow that to bleed over into the church, we run the risk of shortchanging our ability to really intently study the truth and to have reasonable and objective thoughts, not just about the Bible, but about our faith in general, particularly in terms of debates with other faiths and how we can tell false from correct narratives and truths. I think we as the church need to always focus on studying the Bible in its written form and making sure that we develop the characteristics of a well-reasonable mind that can study and that can process information to the best of its ability.